He forged my father's signature, and I let him think it worked. My father died on a Tuesday. I know that sounds like the kind of detail that shouldn't matter, but it does because my stepmother, my father's second wife, the woman he married 6 years ago when I was 27, and too polite to say what I actually thought of her, she had the locks changed by Thursday morning. Not metaphorically. Literally. I drove back to the house to pick up the rest of my things, the last box of my dad's books that I'd asked her if I could have, and my key didn't work. I stood on that porch for a full minute, turning it over and over in the lock, before I understood what had happened. She'd been planning this before he was even in the ground. My father's name was William, Bill, to his friends. Dad to me, his only child, the daughter he raised alone after my mother left when I was 4. He wasn't a perfect man, said, "I love you," like it was something that needed to be rationed. But he was mine, and I was his, and when he got sick, pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in February, gone by April, I took leave from my job, moved back into my childhood home, and sat with him through every bad night. His wife, Celeste, was there too. I want to be fair about that. She showed up, but she also kept asking the estate attorney questions I thought were strange at the time. Things like, and if he passes without updating the trust documents, what happens then? Questions that, in retrospect, were less about grief and more about strategy. My dad had a house. Not a mansion. Not some sprawling estate. A 4-bedroom colonial in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio. The house where I'd grown up. The house where I'd learned to ride a bike in the driveway, and burned my first batch of cookies in the kitchen. He'd paid it off years ago. It was worth somewhere around $740,000 in the current market, which I knew because Celeste had mentioned it, casually, at dinner, about 3 weeks before my father died. Not as a conversation starter. As a closing statement. What I also knew, because my father had told me himself, was that he'd set up the house in a living trust years before he met Celeste. The trust named me as the primary beneficiary. When he remarried, he updated his will to include her. She would receive his retirement accounts, his car, his personal property, but the house was mine. He'd been very clear about that. He sat me down and told me directly, "The house goes to you. I don't want you to ever not have a place to land." I had a copy of the trust. I'd had it for 3 years, tucked in a fireproof box under my bed in my apartment. What I didn't know, until a Monday morning 6 days after my father's funeral, was that Celeste had found someone willing to help her pretend that wasn't true. I got a call from a real estate attorney I'd never heard of. His name was on a firm I didn't recognize. He told me, very professionally, very smoothly, that he was handling the sale of a property at my father's address, and that per the updated trust document signed in March. Signed, he said, by my father, I had no claim on the proceeds. He said this like he was reading me weather data, like it was simply information being transferred between two parties. I asked him to repeat the date. March. My father was in hospice by mid-March. He could barely hold a pen. What updated trust documents? I said. The amendment filed on March 14th, he said. Executed by your father, witnessed and notarized. I didn't say anything for a moment. I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of a grocery store. Engine off. And I remember staring at a shopping cart that someone had left half in a space, and thinking, this is what it feels like when someone bets on the fact that you're too tired to fight back. I was tired. I had been awake for most of the previous 6 months. I'd watched my father shrink, watched the man who used to carry me on his shoulders become someone who needed help getting to the bathroom. I was 31 years old, and I felt 85. And this man on the phone, this attorney whose name I was already writing down, was telling me that someone had used that exhaustion as a window. I'll need a copy of those documents, I said. I'm not obligated. I know you're not obligated, I said. But I'm asking. He said he'd look into it. He did not sound like a man who intended to look into it. I drove home and I called my father's original estate attorney, a woman named Miss Hartfield, who had handled the trust setup years ago, and who had met me exactly once at a document signing and still sent me a handwritten sympathy card after my father passed. I explained what I'd been told. There was a pause on her end that told me everything I needed to know before she said a word. That trust had a specific amendment clause, she said. Any changes required dual signatures, yours and your father's, because you were named as a co-trustee after your mother's parental rights were terminated. That was built in deliberately. So an amendment signed only by him would be invalid, she said. At minimum. At most, it would be fraud. I sat with that word for a second. Fraud. It has weight when someone says it out loud in a legal context, when it stops being a general accusation and becomes a specific thing with specific consequences. Don't contact Celeste, Ms. Hartfield said. Don't contact the buyer. Don't post anything anywhere. Just come to my office tomorrow morning and bring everything you have. I brought the original trust documents. I brought every email my father had ever sent me about the house. I brought a photograph, one I almost hadn't kept, taken on March 12th, 2 days before the alleged amendment signing date, showing my father asleep in his hospital bed at the hospice facility, an IV in his arm, a morphine drip running. He was not a man who was signing legal documents on March 14th. He was a man who was fighting to breathe. Miss Hartfield looked at the photo for a long moment. The closing is scheduled for when? She asked. 3 weeks from Friday, I said. Good, she said. That gives us time. I want to tell you what those 3 weeks were like, because I think it matters. I went to work, I answered emails. I called my best friend on Thursday nights and talked about other things. because I couldn't talk about this yet without my voice going flat and strange. I slept badly and woke up at 3 a.m. thinking about the shopping cart in the parking lot, about how Celeste had stood at my father's graveside in a black dress that still had the tags tucked inside the collar, about the way she'd put her hand on my arm afterward and said, "We'll figure everything out, sweetheart." I had thought she meant we would figure it out together. Miss Hartfield filed a motion with the probate court. She also contacted a forensic document examiner, a woman who spent her career analyzing signatures and ink and paper, and the specific, measurable ways that people lie on paper. The examiner looked at the March 14th amendment, and she looked at documents my father had definitely signed, his hospice admission paperwork, his DNR, letters he'd written in January when he was still himself, and she wrote up a 12-page report. The signature on the March 14th amendment was not my father's. The ink was consistent with a pen type my father never used. The pressure pattern was wrong. The way he formed the letter W at the start of his name was a distinctive habit he'd had his whole life. A slight leftward lean on the first stroke, and it wasn't there. Whoever had signed that document had practiced. They'd gotten close. But close, in document examination, is a confession. Miss Hartfield also pulled the notarization's records. The notary's license number on the amendment traced to a man who had surrendered his notary commission in 2023 after an unrelated complaint. He was not a valid notary. The stamp was either stolen or fabricated. We had everything. I want to be clear about something. I never called Celeste. I never sent a message. Never showed up at the house. Never did anything that would signal that I knew what she had done. I read once that the worst thing you can do when someone is trying to cheat you is let them know you know, because then they can adjust. They can lawyer up. They can destroy evidence. They can disappear. Celeste thought I was a grieving daughter who was too emotionally wrecked to read the fine print. I let her keep thinking that. She texted me once, 2 weeks before the closing. "Hi, sweetheart, hope you're holding up. I know this has been so hard on both of us. Just want you to know I'm thinking of you." I read it at my kitchen table, and then I set my phone face down and finished my coffee. The closing was scheduled for a Friday at 10 a.m. at a title company office downtown. Ms. Hartfield had coordinated with the probate court. We had a temporary restraining order on the sale, which had been quietly filed and just as quietly not yet served, timed deliberately. She'd also been in contact, through proper channels, with the county prosecutor's office. This wasn't just a civil matter anymore. I showed up at the title company at 9:52 a.m. I wore a navy blazer. I had my copy of the original trust documents in a folder. I had a copy of the forensic report. I had a copy of the photo of my father in hospice. I had the court order. I had everything in a neat stack, held together with a binder clip, like I was showing up for a business meeting. Because that's what my father always said. You walk into a room like you belong there and people will believe you do. The receptionist looked up when I came through the door. "I'm here for the closing on the colonial property," I said, and gave the address. She nodded and gestured toward a conference room down the hall. I could see through the glass wall. Celeste was already there, sitting across from a man in a suit I didn't recognize. The attorney from the phone call, I assumed. There was a buyer there too, a couple, looking slightly uncomfortable in the way that people look when they sense something is off but can't name it yet. A title officer was arranging paperwork at the head of the table. I opened the conference room door. Celeste looked up. I watched her face go through several things very quickly. Surprise, confusion, a flash of something I can only describe as calculation, and then a smile that didn't reach anything above her cheekbones. "Oh," she said. "I didn't know you were coming." "I know," I said. I sat down. The attorney in the suit, I'll call him what he was, which is a man who had agreed to facilitate a fraudulent sale, and was about to understand the consequences of that, started to say something about my presence being unexpected. I slid the court order across the table before he finished his sentence. "Temporary restraining order from the Franklin County Probate Court," I said. "The sale cannot proceed." The title officer picked it up. Read it, set it down, looked at the attorney. The attorney's face did something complicated. Celeste said, "I don't understand what." "The trust amendment dated March 14th is a forgery," I said. I was very calm when I said it. I had practiced being calm. "The signature is not my father's. The notarization was performed with an invalid commission. I have a forensic document examination report that establishes both of those things. And the county prosecutor's office has been notified." The room was very quiet. The buyer, the husband, leaned over and said something quietly to his wife. She nodded. They were already pulling away from the table, already somewhere else emotionally, and I didn't blame them. They hadn't done anything wrong. They were just people who had wanted to buy a house and had accidentally walked into something else entirely. The title officer stood up. "I need to make a call," she said, and left the room. The attorney in the suit had gone a specific shade of pale that I recognized from a documentary I once watched about people who realize mid-sentence that they are in significantly more trouble than they understood. Celeste looked at me. "You're making a mistake," she said. Her voice was steady. I gave her credit for that. "I have a photograph of my father in hospice on March 12th, I said. "He was on a morphine drip. He couldn't have signed anything 2 days later. Whoever signed that document, whoever arranged for it to be signed, committed wire fraud and document fraud in connection with a real estate transaction. That's federal territory." She didn't say anything after that. The title officer came back with someone from the company's legal department. Miss Hartfield arrived at 10:18 a.m. She'd been in the parking lot, waiting for my text. She came in with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had spent decades being underestimated and had long since stopped finding it interesting. The closing did not happen. What happened instead was a series of events that unfolded over the following weeks, methodically, the way things do when the legal system is moving in one direction, and there's nothing to stop it. The fraudulent amendment was formally voided by the probate court. The title to the house was confirmed as belonging to the trust, with me as the beneficiary. The notary stamp was traced. I won't go into all the details because some of it is still ongoing, but I will say that the man whose name was on that stamp had a relationship with Celeste's previous attorney, and that relationship became very interesting to investigators very quickly. Celeste hired a defense attorney. I know this, because Miss Hartfield mentioned it. Neutrally, the way she mentions most things. The couple who'd been planning to buy the house. They found another property. I hope it works out for them. None of this was their fault. The house is mine. I went back for the first time about 3 weeks after the closing was stopped, when the restraining order had been formalized, and Celeste had moved out to stay with her sister. I used the spare key I'd had since I was 16. The one my dad made for me when I first got my driver's license so I could always get home. I walked through the front door and stood in the entryway, and looked at the stairs and the mark on the doorframe in the kitchen where my dad used to track my height every birthday, and I stood there for a while. I didn't cry. I thought I would, but I didn't. I just stood there and breathed in the smell of the place, which still smelled like him a little. The particular brand of coffee he used, old wood, the faint ghost of the candles my mother had burned 30 years ago. And I thought about what he had said to me the last real conversation we had where he was, still himself enough to mean the words. "The house goes to you," he had said. "I don't want you to ever not have a place to land." He had built that protection in deliberately, years before he met Celeste, years before he knew he would need it. He had thought ahead, the way he always thought ahead. He just hadn't anticipated that someone would try this hard, or that trying this hard would mean they'd have to forge his name. His name. The name I carry the last half of. Whoever signed that document thought they were clever. They thought that a tired, grieving daughter wouldn't look closely enough, wouldn't know what she had, wouldn't understand that a trust with a dual signature is exactly the kind of thing you can't quietly amend while someone's on a morphine drip, and his kid is down the hall, crying in a plastic hospital chair. They thought wrong. Keep copies of everything. That's what my dad used to say about important documents. He had a filing cabinet in his office, color-coded, labeled in his careful handwriting. Keep copies of everything, because the world will occasionally produce people who are counting on you not to. He taught me well. I landed.